So the overview of this talk, and again, we'll probably skip through some of this, is a little bit, wanted to start out by talking a little bit about organic insect management, what that means, especially if you're growing certified organic. So we're going to talk, or what we can cover in this talk is a little bit about organic insect management. We'll talk a little bit about insect biology and agroecology. Then we'll move into three main cucurbit pests. So we've prepared slides on cucumber beetle, squash vine borer, and squash bug, which are our three, the big three. So first and foremost, I mean, I think the big difference, and this would be probably mostly applicable to folks who are in the process of moving from a conventional production system to an organic one, is that there are some key differences in production, and most of you are probably aware of this. In conventional systems, the sort of approach is we're going to homogenize the system. It's like, well, is this a good corn site? Is this not a good corn site? Doesn't matter. I'm going to grow corn here. I'm going to homogenize it. I'm going to make sure that the plants have the mineral nutrition that they need from synthetic inputs. And if anything comes to give me problems, I'm going to use high energy intensive synthetic inputs to reduce that. So really, you know, the model system, it's almost like, you know, hydroponics would be the ultimate in conventional ag from my perspective. Typically in that type of environment, you know, you don't need to know as much about the ecology and balance of all the various factors that come to play in that production system. In organic systems, of course, I mean, from a regulatory standpoint, if by none others, we have very limited pesticide choices. So right off the bat, we really have to think about the system that we're playing with and the ecological relationships of all those components. And really, just like Dan was talking about in the last talk, you know, it really starts with, you know, prevention. We need healthy plants, and we need to be thinking about, you know, what types of resources do the pest insects that we're worried about need to remain active in our system, and what are the resources that our natural enemies need to try to provide us with some background pest management. And those natural enemies could be microbes, they could be nematodes, they could be other insects, could be birds and rodents. It just depends on the pest that you're trying to manage. This is kind of a regulatory slide, but those of you that are practicing certified organic agriculture and have a farm plan, I mean, there's actually an NOP mandate that you follow what's called the hierarchy of pest management. And the basic idea behind that is you start with prevention, so, you know, good choices in terms of site selection, good choices in terms of rotational or other cultural management tactics, good choices on varieties. So you're not planting a variety that you know is going to cause you problems. If that doesn't work, then we start moving into thinking about physical and biological practices. But essentially there, that might be going out and using cultivation for weeds, or physical removement of a pest, or you know, plasticulture might sort of fall under that line. And maybe using biological inputs. And these could be natural enemies that you foster. They could be natural enemies that you buy and release. You might even consider some biopesticides sort of under this tier of organic pest management. And then finally, our last resort should hopefully always be NOP compliant in pesticides. And the reason I didn't put OMRI here, and most of you are probably aware of this, but the OMRI stamp, OMRI is an independent nonprofit organization. At the end of the day, for those of you growing certified organic crops, and you know, I apologize if you've heard this many, many times, but you need to check with your certifier. Anytime you're going to use a new input on your farm, regardless on whether or not it has the OMRI stamp, your certifier has the final say on whether or not it's compliant with NOP regulations. And certifiers do vary in terms of, you know, what they consider acceptable and don't consider acceptable. So it's always good. You know, sometimes some of them have got websites, and typically if it has the OMRI stamp, you know, I think 9 times out of 10 they say no problem. But they don't have to say no problem. And I have talked to growers who've backed themselves into a corner because they haven't done their homework. But again, that's more of a regulatory sort of bureaucratic thing. But if you've put in the time and dollars, you know, in 3 years to get to your certification, you certainly don't want to lose it, you know, just because of you know, a small mistake. My opinion is that if you're going to do a good job managing an insect, you sort of need to think like an insect and think about, you know, what are the habitat requirements of this, you know, particular type of life. Insects have been around for at least 500 million years. Flying insects have been around for about 320 million years. To give you a perspective, agriculture has been around for about 10 to 12,000 years, depending on who you listen to. And ourselves as a species, at most we're 150,000 years old. So if you think about it, I mean, these are creatures that have had a tremendous amount of time to develop very subtle and interrelated evolutionary relationships with the plants that they eat and with the other things that they eat and the other things they do. That said, some of the things that are really nice about insects is they're cold-blooded. And you know, I bring this up. Most of you probably knew this. I mean, you learned this in elementary school. But this is really meaningful. Cold-blooded organisms are predictable. The reason they're predictable is they rely on ambient conditions to drive their metabolism. As endothermic vertebrates, you know, we kind of create our own metabolism, right? We experience time linearly. So, and this is meaningful. Insects don't experience time linearly from the standpoint of age and development. They experience time as a function of time to some extent and temperature. So that's why things like degree day models work, because we can predict when insects are going to be at a particular stage if we have some idea of where that population is in its development, and we can monitor temperature. But that makes them predictable, and I think that's a very important thing to always remember. Also, they're cyclical. I mean, like all things in nature, there's a cycle to insects. And understanding about how a particular insect, what type of metamorphosis it goes through and where it does damage and everything is critical to managing them. And then finally, most insects, and the insects that we're going to talk about are all direct pests with a long evolutionary history with the crops that they attack. They have very specific needs, and if we can understand what their needs are in terms of habitat, we can hopefully disrupt that habitat in such a way that it's not conducive. You can think about it as we don't want to set the table for them. We want to give them just, you know, maybe the leftovers, you know, you wouldn't even give your farm dog, you know. I'm going to trade off to my colleague, Zsofia Szendrei here.
We thought we would give you a little bit of basics about insects because identifying them can be sometimes difficult. And this would be a perfect example that's related to cucurbits, where you have two insects that superficially look similar. They are both yellow-striped beetles, and they occur about the same time in the field, or they can occur about the same time in the field, and they both feed on cucurbits. But the way that you tell them apart in this case is that this insect has a little bit of its abdomen hanging out of its wings, so you can see the soft parts of the insect hanging out in the back. And also, if you flip them over, this would be black from below, and this would be yellow if you flip them around and you looked at them. So that's how you can tell them apart. And that's a lot of useful information, because then you know whether that insect might have something to do with your neighbor's corn, for example, and they've rotated out of corn, and now all the corn rootworms are coming over and visiting your cucurbits because they have nothing else to feed on, or whether the cucumber beetles are living in your farm and you're growing your own cucumber beetles in debris that you leave from previous years in and around the fields. So you would manage them and you would look at them differently from that perspective, especially in the long-term management of these two insects. So being able to identify insects is useful. And so based on that, I was going to go over a few slides here that tell you what an insect is. And this is in particular looking at like the general scope of the insect when it's in the adult life stage. So we're looking at an insect when we see a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. We have 6 legs, so 3 pairs of legs. So mites and spiders are not considered insects. They're all arthropods, but they're not insects, although I work on all of those. We have usually some numbers of wings. The most typical is 4, so 2 pairs of wings, but there are some insects that don't have wings at all, especially if you consider larval stages. But we also have flies that only have 2 wings, for example. So here we have a lady beetle, and you can see the 2 wings that are underneath the hard wings that are actually used for flying. The other 2, the hard wings on the top, are just there to protect the insect. So now I'm going to switch to talking about understanding the life stages and what life stage is causing damage to cucurbits. Here we have 2 different pests. So this is the squash bug. Here is the larva or the immature stage of the squash bug, and here is an adult squash bug, and here is a squash vine borer. And these are good examples for 2 different strategies, because in this insect you have all of the life stages feeding on your crop, while in this insect you only have the larvae attacking the crop. But in order to manage squash vine borers, you need to understand when adults are being active, because you're managing the adults to reduce the number of larvae that are going to subsequently damage the crop. And we'll talk about that in a minute in more detail. So how are insects developing is also important, because you have these things that look very different sometimes, but they are the same species. So case in here is the squash bug. You can see squash bug eggs. I'm pretty sure if you've grown squash before, you have seen these. They're very characteristic. They're bronze-looking eggs. They're laid in a clutch, usually on the underside of the leaves, but you can sometimes see them on the top of the leaves as well. And these eggs hatch into larvae or immatures or nymphs. We use all those names. And when they hatch, they are usually two colors. So they have a black head or black head and thorax and a brownish abdomen. And then they change color as they grow. So they are shape-shifters in the insect world. And they grow into these ash-colored or gray-colored nymphs. So if you look at these 3 different photos alone, you can see that they look drastically different, but they are the same insect, and they will do damage in the same way. And so these nymphs subsequently grow into this adult that I'm pretty sure you have seen if you grow squash. So the difference here is that you have the nymphs that are unable to fly. They have little wing pads, but they don't have fully developed wings. They also can't reproduce. They don't have fully developed reproductive organs. And that's why these are different from the adult, which is much more mobile. It can move around. It can fly large distances, and it's able to reproduce. So the other strategy in the insect world to develop is called a complete metamorphosis, where you go from also the egg stage. So I'm showing you an example of eggs of the squash vine borer. I'm not sure if you have seen these. The growers that I work with, they don't tend to complain about this insect as much as the other 2 species that I'm going to talk about. So the eggs in this case are similar looking to the squash bug eggs. They are brown, but they're laid individually, and they're almost always found on the stems. And so they're hard to see. You kind of have to bend down, look underneath the foliage, survey the entire stem, and find these eggs laid individually if you wanted to look for eggs. So these eggs, they hatch, and the larvae burrow into the stem, and it's called a borer because the larva is digging through the stems, eating the stem from the inside out. And I'll show you pictures later on too, but these tunnels they can be the entire length of the stem, and the larva is creating holes throughout the stem where the excrement is being pushed out. So I usually see these holes on the stem, and that's kind of the indication that there's a larva inside. So it's called complete metamorphosis because you're going through to the pupal stage. This is a quiescent stage of the insect, which is the stage where it can change into the adult stage, which looks completely different from this larval stage. So now here you have a cleared wing moth. They're called cleared wing moth because if you look at the hind wing of this insect, you can actually see through it. It's a moth, and the way that it has the wings is that the front wings have scales, but the hind wings don't have scales. They have a membrane, but it's transparent, so the light comes through. Yeah. So the larvae come out of the stem, they drop down into the soil, they burrow in, and then they pupate in the soil. They stay there for a few weeks, and then the adults come out. So we're going to talk a little bit about how insects cause damage. I think it goes back to being able to identify what your problem is in the field. The 2 large categories, one of them is the chewing type of damage, which is characteristic of the beetles. They chew holes. Also the flea beetles that came up before, they have very small mouth parts, but they are chewing mouth parts, and they cause those very little holes on the leaves by chewing away the tissue. Same with the cucumber beetles. They can feed on the leaves, they can feed on the flowers, and they can also feed on the fruit with their chewing mouth parts. So the characteristic sign is that there's a piece of leaf missing in this case. compare that to the insects with the sucking mouth parts, these are actually mouth parts that look like a straw, and the insect will stab that straw-like mouth part into the tissue. It will exude saliva into the plant, and that saliva is filled with digestive fluid. So that digestive fluid will start breaking down the tissue, and then once that soup is created, the insect just sucks it back up into its mouth and starts feeding on it. So when you look at this kind of damage over here, so here is a squash bug nymph feeding on a squash leaf over there. The damage looks a lot more like diseases, and this is where I think people start getting lost with what's a disease, what's an insect, when it comes to these piercing, sucking, mouth part feeding damage types. So you can see a lot of these squash bug nymphs aggregating on the plant and feeding, and when you have so many of them doing the damage, you can really have significant losses of photosynthetic surface. I'm going to switch to talking about natural enemies next. In cucurbits, we have both parasitoids and predators. These are the two large categories of natural enemies that we differentiate in entomology. And I'm showing you photos of both of them. So here is a cucumber beetle adult, and this is a parasitoid fly pupa that's hanging off of the beetle. So basically there is a fly that comes to the beetle, puts an egg on the beetle, the egg hatches, the larva will burrow into the beetle, will feed on the inside of the insect, and then when it's time for it to pupate, it comes out on the surface and creates this pupa. And so for a lot of that development, unfortunately, the cucumber beetle is active and it's feeding, so it's not a very good parasitoid in the sense that it leaves the cucumber beetle to do its thing for a long period of time before it causes its demise and kills it off. So in that sense, it's not a very efficient parasitoid. We also have predators that I'm showing you over here. In the world of the predators, we have ones with chewing mouth parts and ones with piercing, sucking mouth parts. And the one that I'm showing you here, you can see that it has this piercing, sucking mouth part. It basically stabbed the beetle, and it's now sucking out the juices. Same idea with the digestive fluids injected before it can consume the inside. So these are just some photos from Michigan vegetable fields, the things that I see as I visit fields. We have quite a few species of lady beetles. We have some that are native. This is our pink lady beetle, pink spotted lady beetle, and then we have some that are invasive. This is the Asian lady beetle. The lady beetles in general are good predators of aphids, but they will also eat eggs of just about anything. So we talked a little bit about cabbage pests. They will eat eggs of the imported cabbage worm, for example. So they're, in general, good predators to have around. Then we have these things. Does anybody know what these are? They're called big-eyed bugs. If you look at the side of the head, they have like these huge eyes. Predators in general have big eyes because if they need to see the prey and they need to catch it, they need to be vigilant and have good observational skills. So these are big-eyed bugs. They're about the size of a leafhopper, I would say, and they're great predators of leafhoppers. Oftentimes, these also have those piercing, sucking mouth parts, and oftentimes I will see them in the field running around with a leafhopper on their beak. As they're feeding on the leafhopper, they're going around doing their thing. So they're pretty efficient predators of small things in general. And then, does anybody know this one? It's like a brown marmorated sting bug. It's in the same family. It's related closely to that one. But the brown marmorated sting bug feeds on plants and is a pest. And this one is actually a predator. It's called a spine soldier bug. And it's also with this piercing, sucking mouth part, and it can feed on larvae, for example, very efficiently. This one I like to point out because people tend not to know what that insect is. It's the larva of something. Does anybody know? That's a lacewing larva, that's right. So people usually think that this, because it looks a little bit nasty, they think it's a pest and they want to kill it, but it's really a good aphid predator. It has these huge mandibles. They're modified mandibles that stick out on its head, and it goes up to the aphid, it stabs it from both sides. it holds it up above its head and then starts drinking the juices that dribble out of the aphid. So it's a great aphid predator. And then we have ground beetles. Ground beetles are extremely diverse. Some of them feed on weed seeds. Some of them are predators. Some of them are both. And so you really want to keep them around and encourage them as best as you can in your fields because they are valuable feeding on things that are on the ground. They tend not to get up on the plants except for some species. Generally, they will consume things that are moving around on the ground. So parasitoids tend to fall into two categories, flies and wasps. So flies, they look like the house fly for the most part. And then the wasps, I think, are surprising because they range from things that are really, really small to fairly large insects. So what do these things eat? And you really want to understand what they eat to be able to help them and make them more abundant in your production. This is a lady beetle larva. It looks much like a lacewing larva. It doesn't have those prominent mouth parts that I talked about. It does have pretty strong mouth parts, but they're not as prominent. They tend to come in black and yellow colors, different variation of black and yellow. Here you can see that it's feeding on an aphid, so they're excellent aphid predators. And here is the adult feeding on eggs of Colorado potato beetle in this case, but they will feed on aphids and other eggs and larvae in the garden as well. Now, in that case that I just showed you, both adults and larvae are predaceous, but a lot of the other predators that we have are, for example, in the adult stage are not predaceous, which is the case for the lacewing. So these are the kinds of predators, and parasitoids are falling into this category too, where you really want to have some other resources available for them to be able to feed on and reproduce. If this lacewing adult didn't have access to nectar and pollen in its adult life stage, it wouldn't be able to reproduce, or it would be able to reproduce only for a very short period of time. By providing these flowering resources for them, you can really extend the longevity and provide them with habitat in the farm. The parasitoids are very similar to what I just described, where the adults are searching around to feed on nectar and pollen, and the larvae are feeding on the insides, usually on the insides of other pests. So here you can see a parasitic wasp. You can see the long ovipositor, very characteristic of parasitic wasps, feeding on flowers. Here is another one feeding on flowers. So that's what they're looking for, diversity of flowers. And because they don't have those long mouth parts that butterfly adults have, they typically are looking for flowers where the nectar is pretty readily available at the surface of the flower. They can't really reach deep into the flower corollas to reach the nectar. I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about bees today. There are three main categories of bees when we think about cucurbits. One of them is the wild bees. Squash bees fall into this, which are particularly interesting for squash growers. We have also the bumblebees that you can see here in the middle, pollinating a squash flower. And then we have honeybees, which provide the majority of pollination in many cases. So out of the three, the squash bees are particularly interesting to us for squash, but not for cucumbers. They're not known to pollinate cucumbers. It goes back to having co-evolved with Old World versus New World cucurbits. They pollinate squash-type flowers, but they don't pollinate the little flowers that cucumbers and watermelon and things like that produce. So you can try to encourage these in the farm by providing them nesting sites, and I'll show you a short video on the biology of this insect. They prefer to have open ground, so that's where kind of the goals that you want to reach with having all these cover crops and what you would like to do with insects, I think a little bit collide, and I'll talk about that in a minute when we get to the cucumber beetles. But these bees actually like to have open sandy ground, and they like to nest near their hosts. So if, like what Jacob has here, with the clover, you really don't provide any open ground, I'm not sure if you have very many of these bees, but maybe in your farm elsewhere you can provide a type of habitat that they would nest in, and they can travel short distances to get to the pollinating crop.
All right, so now we're going to move into killing stuff. Or making things inhospitable for things we don't want. All right. Let's see here. So we're going to talk about 3 pests, as I mentioned. I think I gave you the wrong order earlier. We wanted to start with squash vine borer. As Zsofia mentioned, larger conventional commercial operations don't typically have a problem with this pest. Typically, where we see this or where we hear complaints are backyard gardeners and small diversified operations. Why that is, I'm not entirely sure. Likely, I would sort of guess that it's because what we're seeing is females that have mated coming out of sort of wild native hosts and then moving into fields. And it's probably just sort of an edge area kind of relationship where if you just have a small block of squash the size of this room, there's a lot of edge relative to the center of the plot. If you have a 50-acre block of cucurbit, they may not penetrate all the way into the center. It's a very beautiful insect. Here's the clear wings that Zsofia was describing earlier. This family of insect is a Ceciidae. These are clear-winged moths. Some other notable members of this family include the dogwood borer, the lesser and greater peach tree borer, as well as the grapevine borer. The squash vine borer is sometimes mistaken as a bee because of its appearance, and some of the other borers in this family are very easy to mistake for a hornet or a bee. They sort of mimic that appearance. This is the larvae of the insect, as Zsofia mentioned earlier, and as the name suggests, it makes its living on the inside of the squash plant. And that presents some real challenges for management once the damage is started, because it's very hard to reach this guy with really anything, short of a spike or something like that. The adults, like a lot of moths and butterflies, feed on flowers and get nectar from flowers to keep their energy levels up and move around. So here's vine borer damage. I remember the first time I dealt with this pest was in my backyard garden in Kansas. I had no familiarity with the insect. Oftentimes what will happen is you'll have this big, beautiful vine. Everything's going great. You're starting to put some nice flowers on, maybe a little fruitlets, and then you go out one day and it's collapsed. And you look at it and you say, well, what happened? What happens is the female lays her eggs on the stem, and then the larvae bores in, and this is severe damage and pretty typical. I remember the first time I saw this pest, I thought a rat had come into my garden and just chewed the heck out of my stems, because you get this sort of pulpy, nasty mess. And what this are holes where the larvae is actually pushing its poop or frass out of the hole. So oftentimes what you'll see is this sort of either a round or jagged hole with this sort of brownish yellow, nasty, gunky gunk that's getting pushed out. And the plant will collapse, because basically what's happening is this little caterpillar is feeding on all the vascular tissue in this plant, and it basically destroys the xylem and the phloem, and the plant can't transfer water or nutrients anymore, so it begins to wilt and die. So for monitoring this pest, obviously one way to see it is you see a plant that's dying and you find the sort of chewed up vine. A better way to do it, though, is we can use traps. Most of the Ceciids are very much reliant on sex pheromones, and their sex pheromones are very active. We use a bucket-style trap to catch this, but basically you put a pheromone inside this trap, the males are attracted to it, and they fly in there and they die. And so you can monitor that weekly, and that'll give you some idea of when these moths are active in your area and whether or not you want to begin scouting for eggs or early larval damage, or whether you want to make an insecticide application. This is the cucumber beetle, and we've talked about that a little bit. These are in the genus Diabrotica. There's actually 3 Diabroticas. This is the one that we most commonly deal with in Michigan, the striped cucumber beetle. The life cycle of the cucumber beetle is 1 generation per year, essentially, and this will vary a bit by the year and the temperature and where you are in our state. But they overwinter as adults, and they overwinter in vegetation from the previous year. So one way to help manage these is don't leave a lot of squash waste in your fields. Dispose of it. Either chop it up with a flail mower, compost it. Just don't leave it laying around. They come out in May or June, depending where you're at. The adults will feed and mate at that point, and then they lay their eggs. Now, this insect has a full or complete metamorphosis, so the larvae really don't resemble the adults at all. They lay their eggs in the soil next to the squash plant, and then those larvae feed on the developing roots of your squash plant. The adults will also feed on the leaves, and they feed on the fruit as well. They're long-lived because the adults do actively feed on the plant. In the case of a lot of moths and butterflies, they may not be very long-lived because they don't take in a lot of plant material. So larvae develop on the roots. They pupate, I believe, shallow in the soil, and the subsequent generation emerges in August. They'll feed and mate, and this is where we see, adult cucumber beetle damage on our final product at the end of the season. And then they go and they look for a place to overwinter. And again, if they have good habitat right nearby, they'll probably set up shop right nearby. If they have to go a distance, they'll go a distance to find a place. So one generation per year. And so the nice thing about dealing with an insect that has one generation per year is that if you can maintain good prevention, you're not likely to see a massive buildup of the pest in a single year. All right. So cucumber beetle damage. Cucumber beetle can damage cucumbers really in 4 different ways if you think about it. So obviously the larvae can feed on roots, and that can have negative impacts on plant vigor. The adults will feed on leaves and flowers, and you'll oftentimes find them in flowers. So here's a flower with a bunch of striped cucumber beetles on it. And then also they'll feed on the leaves. They have chewing mouthparts, so they're physically removing parts from the leaves. They'll tend to skeletonize leaves or kind of make window panes in the leaves, so they don't necessarily feed from the edge of the leaf in, but feed from the interior of the leaf. The other way they can damage your crop, obviously, and this is more late in the season with the generation that emerges in the summer, is they will feed directly on the squash, and they leave this sort of rasping type damage. But probably the most significant form of damage that cucumber beetle can cause is they are vectors of bacterial wilt of cucurbits. So if they feed on an infected plant, the bacteria will take up residence in the salivary glands of the insect, and then it will actually move that bacteria from plant to plant. So for monitoring this pest, there are 2 ways you can really go about it rather than just physically going out and looking for it. You can buy pheromone-baited sticky traps, and these will trap actually I think there's one Diabrotica species it won't capture, but it will capture the striped and I believe the spotted cucumber beetle. This sticky card is folded over, and there's actually a pheromone lure in the inside. It's kind of like a little envelope. But this is one fairly simple way to do that. Another thing you can do is you can use bowl traps. The color is what's attractive about this, so all you need to do is put water with a few drops of dish soap to break the surface tension. These do a pretty good job of catching early emerging striped cucumber beetles before there are flowers in the fields. The first place you always see striped cucumber beetle is in large squash flowers. Seeing as there are no large squash flowers when you would put these out, they assume that that's a flower. They land on it. When they touch the water, because of the soap in there, it breaks the surface tension. They fall in, and you can use that. So squash bug, my experience with this pest is some years I have a horrific amount of it. Other years I don't. Like the striped cucumber beetle, these overwinter as adults. And again, they tend to overwinter in squash residue in the field. So squash bug damage, as Zsofia talked about, oftentimes what you'll see is this discoloration of leaves or a kind of a stippling effect on fruit. So you'll see pucker marks and things. So next we wanted to talk about management. Rather than talking about management for each of these pests, because the management tactics we have are fairly limited in organic management, we figured we'd sort of mix this all together because there's a lot of commonalities between them. So the place to start is by design or cultural pest management. And this is where having a healthy soil nutrition program, using composts or other organic soil amendments to make sure that you're promoting a healthy soil and a healthy plant is important. A varietal choice is very important. And then rotations can be very important. Rotations are difficult, though, if you are a small diversified farmer, because you sort of are, the scale at which you're rotating is usually in the maybe tens or hundreds of yards, not the thousands or 10,000s of yards. And many of these insects can move quite some distance. But still, if you can keep them from maintaining residence in the plot where you're producing this year's crop, you're always going to be better off. So we'll start with pest management by design. So the first place to really think about this is host plant resistance. And so here's a table which provides you with sort of a variety or type and the attractiveness of these cucurbit cultivars to egg laying by the squash vine borer. So a high number is bad. So butternut squash is not a preferred ovipositional resource for this this insect, but Hubbard squash is very much a preferred host for this insect. So if you are experiencing a lot of pressure, one of the things you might do is don't grow varieties that are favorable for this pest. And if you can do that maybe for a few years, you might be able to reduce the local populations and sort of rotate your way out of it. So for cucumber beetle, what we see across the cucurbits is from least resistant to most resistant. As the name might suggest, cucumbers are obviously one of its really preferred things to feed on. And then as you move down this list to the pumpkin, summer squash, watermelon, they're less susceptible or less favorable a host. All right, so squash bug. Here we find that the zucchinis are more resistant than some of the butternuts. So again, it's kind of a mixed bag. And this is where I would think about keeping good records of what kind of pest pressure you have in a given year might be a good idea for deciding what you want to plant in a subsequent year. It's kind of a balancing act, and there's no real good simple answer. It's going to depend on your context. So trap cropping is something that's been looked at pretty extensively in conventional agriculture. The concept in trap cropping is what we do is we oftentimes will plant a perimeter crop that's extremely attractive to our target pest or pests. And the idea is that you use that as a place to concentrate the pest. In conventional agriculture, what we'll typically do then is we'll apply a bunch of nasty insecticides and kill them in that first line of defense. In organics, we're a bit limited in that area because we don't have a lot of nasty insecticides that provide a lot of really good effective kill. But there are some ways to use this, I think. So again, the trap crop, you want to use something that is very much preferred by the pests, so you'd want to use a highly susceptible variety. And the idea would be to put it as a barrier between where you think the pest is likely emigrating from to concentrate them in an area. Most often, it's a good idea to get your trap crop in before you put your main crop in. One tactic that's been used in cucurbits is to use transplants. So say you're planting cucumber by seed, you might put a perimeter planting from transplants of something like Blue Hubbard or Waltham butternut, something like that. So that plant is bigger, has big flowers, and is more attractive to, for instance, for striped cucumber beetle before your cucumbers become viable. Now, what you do with the insect once it's concentrated here is sort of the complicated part. In organics, our way to really manage the pest in this area is probably going to be, physical destruction or burning of that trap crop. But you don't want to do that until you're pretty sure most of the insects are populated in there. So, and here's just a picture of a muskmelon being protected by a surrounding trap crop of butternut squash. And again, note that these plants were either, if they're grown from seed, they were planted quite a bit earlier. More likely, they were transplants put in, and these guys were grown from seed. So you've got essentially an attractive barrier around your crop, and you're hoping that they'll stay in here. Based on sort of my anecdotal experience with this in organics, the big benefit you typically get out of something like this is it slows the invasion of your main crop. And it works better the bigger your block is. So assuming we've done our best, we've got a healthy soil, we've used a resistant variety, we're not growing the same crop and certainly not the same cultivar in the same place over and over and over again. We're being good stewards of our soil and land, but we still have a pest management problem. Now we sort of have to roll into more physical interventions or more energy-intensive interventions. And so the first of these are really physical pest management, where we physically do something to the pest, and then maybe biological practices. And here I just wanted to talk a little bit about biological control. Really, in extensive outdoor agriculture where you can't control a natural enemy that you purposely release, oftentimes what we find a better way to go about trying to get biocontrol in your system is to provide resources for natural enemies. So in greenhouses, for instance, or hoop houses, I can release ladybird beetles, especially if it's a glass house, and they're going to stay around because they can't get out. And so they're going to stay and they're going to eat what's there. In an outdoor agricultural system, if you go out and release, say, a bunch of adult lacewings or ladybird beetles or something like that, more often than not, they're going to disperse. Ladybird beetles in particular, the commercial ones you buy, are typically collected from overwintering aggregations in the Sierra Nevada, and they're sort of pre-programmed, they're genetically programmed to, when I wake up, the last place I want to be is amongst, a million of my brothers and sisters and cousins, because there's not going to be any food. We're just going to eat each other. So they immediately disperse. So again, in extensive outdoor agriculture, the direction we're going in biocontrol is to figure out ways to make a habitat that promotes the existence of our predators and parasites. And there's different ways to go about this. I mean, one way to do it is to put strips of flowering plants in your main crops. One crop that we found to be very attractive for a lot of predators and parasitoids is sweet alyssum. When you are doing this, one thing to be aware of is that one of the problems we have with biological control in agricultural systems as really a sustainable pest management tactic is that we create a very unnatural system. And you can think about it like a pyramid. And so at the bottom of our trophic structure, our first level of organization and our broad base are producers, which are plants. And that's what fixes sunlight and water and carbon dioxide into sugars, and eventually all the other building blocks of life. So everything we need to make amino acids and everything else. Those are at the base, and that's what we try to grow in plant agriculture. Then as you move up, you get into herbivores. And so the herbivores for us oftentimes are pests. Well, the herbivores, you have less herbivores than you have plants, and that should be somewhat intuitive. Typically, things that eat other things need more of the things they eat than what they are. Otherwise, they go extinct because they run out of food. So herbivores are our pest level, so you're kind of working your way up this pyramid. And then at the top of the pyramid, we have predators, and that's what our natural enemies are, predators and parasitoids. Now, the rule of thumb in ecology is that as you move up a trophic structure, or the levels in a food chain, if you will, there's a tenfold concentration of resources. So what that means is to produce 1 pound of aphid biomass, I need 10 pounds of, say, lettuce biomass. So to produce and that 1 pound of aphid biomass is only going to provide enough energy to keep 0.1 pounds of predator and parasite biomass. So the inherent problem of this in our agricultural systems is we're trying to maximize producers, our basal level, and we're trying to minimize our herbivores, and what we end up doing is bottlenecking all our predators and parasites out, because there's never enough biomass for them to eat to maintain themselves in the system. So that's really, in my mind, what a lot of these plantings are about. And again, I like Lee's perspective on weeds. The first time I visited his farm, I said, don't worry about those. That just feeds the stuff that my predators eat. And that's really the thing, is that by maintaining non-crop plants in your habitat, one of the things you're probably doing is maintaining herbivores that don't cause you problems, but are there to feed your predators and parasites so that they can be around when you need them to feed on your pests. And oftentimes for our pests, especially things like, say, an insect that only has one generation per year, there may only be a really critical 2-week, maybe 2-month-long period where you really need predators to feed on them. But those predators need something to eat for the rest of the year. Just like your pollinators need something else, they need other flowers to visit to maintain their populations. So that's really where this I think, fits in. One thing we know from a lot of research done here at Michigan State and other places by Doug Landis and others is that oftentimes in small diversified systems, you probably have enough diversity to support a lot of those services already. And we know that in really big, extensive agriculture, like a section of corn or something like that, there's really not much we can do to promote those services, because the spatial scale of that sort of corn desert is so big that the only things that are going to be there are things that like corn. So the real question is, you know, are you small enough to where you don't need to do anything like this, or are you in that sort of intermediate scale where you really should be thinking about what kinds of flowers and other, you know, cover crops and things to integrate into your system so that you always have flowers around and you're always providing some habitat for non-pestilent aphids and caterpillars and things that don't move over into your main crop, but are there to feed your predators and your parasites. So predators of striped cucumber beetle. So these are the things that you want to promote in your system. And again, you know, something like pyganic is going to have a negative impact on them. But stink bugs, so this is the spine soldier bug. Again, daddy longlegs, ground beetles, ladybird beetles will feed on the eggs. These are, you know, nematodes. The insect pathogenic ones will attack them. And then ants are actually really good predators. Ants can be tricky, though, because they also will farm aphids. So we've talked a little bit about row covers. Here's an image of a Rime row cover on hoops. For all three of these pests, I mean, this put on at the right time period, so you'd want to get these on as soon as, or preferably a little bit before, you captured the squash vine borer. And when you're trying to protect, that's when you'd want to have these on. One of the big problems with this, obviously, is it's very labor intensive. If you're growing, you know, multiple acres of a crop, it may not be feasible. Another issue is for cucurbits, all of those crops need pollination. So if you don't have a resident pollinator population under this Rime cover, you're not going to get any pollination. So at some point, you're going to have to open it up. As soon as you open it up, pest insects will probably come in along with your pollinators. So physical management for squash vine borer, and again, this is going to be very scale dependent. If you have a pheromone trap out and you start catching squash vine borer males, you can start scouting your plants for the eggs. So here's a picture of the eggs. They're these little brown seed-looking eggs that are on the stem, usually at the base of the plant. If you squish them, then they don't hatch. Another thing you can do is physically remove the larvae. It works best if you can catch the small larvae. The big larvae are like the size of the tip of my pinky. And by the time they get that big, probably enough damage has been done to the plant that there's no coming back. What you do then, and this is probably more for a market gardener or a home gardener, you can, you know, pack it with a compost or a high quality soil and push the damaged tissue into the soil to try to promote the squash into rooting in around that spot and regrowing. Assuming, you know, we've basically done a good job to be good stewards of the land. We've chosen as resistant varieties as we can, given the balance we've got to strike. We've done a good job with soil. We've used physical management. We've tried to promote biocontrol. Maybe we've even released some natural enemies or nematodes or fungi or something like that. We've used row covers. We still have a problem. This is the point based on the National Organic Program's hierarchy of pest management, where we're supposed to say, okay, we can use pesticides. And we've got some options, but they're fairly limited. So for the squash vine borer, the pesticides that we have available can be kind of put into two categories. Preventative pesticides, so these would be, you'd want to apply these in a prophylactic way, so in advance of damage. They're not going to help you once that larvae gets into the vine. And then responsive. And these include things like spinosad, so the trade name for that is Entrust, potentially pyganic, azadirachtin, which is neem, natural neem oils. So the idea here, I think, you know, from our review of the literature, Entrust has been shown to be probably the most effective. Basically 4 weekly applications during moth flight have been shown to reduce damage by about 67%. And that's at I don't know, this is 2002, so these rates are probably a little different because they've shifted from a wettable powder to a emulsifiable concentrate in the last 4 years. So spraying at a higher rate provided better control compared to spraying at a lower rate. The responsive approach with BT would be to actually inject your vines with BT pesticide. So what you would do is locate where you have vines that have small pinpricks, and rather than trying to excise the larvae, you inject the insecticidal bacteria. And then parasitic nematodes, I would consider those responsive because what you would be targeting is the pupae after it has left the squash. So for squash bug, we really don't have much. The main reason being that, if you recall, they have a piercing, sucking mouth part, so it's like a hypodermic needle. There's no real way to get a stomach poison into them. So anything that is going to kill a true bug from an insecticide standpoint has to work on contact. And so some of the things that have been used in the past, same sort of group, pyrethrins, neem oil, neem and pyrethrin blends, and then kale and clay can slow down their development. But I would stress that there's very limited data out there. When I go into the primary literature, almost all the studies show that there's no significant effects of most of these insecticides on squash bug damage. True bugs are just really, really hard to control with insecticides if you don't have a good contact poison. Striped cucumber beetle, again, pyrethrins have been looked at. I don't believe and trust has shown much activity on them. Kale and clay has been shown to slow them down. Beneficial nematodes have been looked at for larvae. But larval control is, you're thinking about next year when you go after the larvae. So squash vine borer. So just sort of a summary slide for each of these. Row covers are a potential if you can keep the vine borer from visiting the squash. They can't lay their eggs. Rotating crops is important, especially if you have a resident population. Choosing less susceptible varieties is important. Trap cropping might have some potential, so long as you physically remove that trap crop before the larvae has completed its development. You can try physical removal. And of the NOP compliant insecticides, the one that has showed the most promise is Entrust. For cucumber beetle, same kind of mix. I think if you do have large extents, trap cropping might be something worth considering. Mass trapping is something else. You might use something as simple as a yellow pan trap or a lot of yellow pan traps in advance of flowering. And then for squash bug, probably the biggest thing you can do is removing the overwintering debris. The adult bugs will overwinter right there in your field on the squash detritus that's left behind from the previous year. So these are all the folks that we'd like to acknowledge for this talk, and we can probably take a few more questions. We've covered a lot of stuff.